everybody is still here. We are super glad to see such a nice, strong group. Uh, what's happening? Okay. Thank you. We have 33 participants, so that's wonderful. So, hi everybody. My name is Miriam from the Online World of Learning, and I'm here to introduce Melissa Ann Thomas. Thank you so much for coming. Melissa is here from the Université Paris-Saclay in France, and the division, I guess, is Centrale Supélec. And Melissa is a researcher. She used to teach in high school, and she helps doctoral students and other researchers work on their English in written and communication skills. And she's been working in France since 2008, but joining the Writing Center in 2021. So we're super happy to welcome her back to the conference about design thinking. And I'm so glad you could come. Thank you so, so very much for participating. Yay.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you, Manisha, for inviting me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And everyone can see it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think it's actually sharing the wrong screen. Just one second. It's showing my notes rather than the actual. 1 second.
We didn't see the notes.
Oh, okay, there it is. Okay. Okay, great. So once again, thank you to the Design Thinking Education Conference for inviting me here today. I'm going to be focusing on cohesion and my talk from fragmented to fluid, unlocking cohesion techniques. So as Miriam mentioned, my experience is as both a teacher, the lead instructor for our research and scientific communication courses, as well as in our proofreading sessions. And this is through our little department called the Academic Writing Center, and we serve the research community starting from doctoral students onward. So that's going to be the population that I refer to today later on when I walk you through my own cohesion workshop that I teach at Centrale Supélec. So I just wanted to start off very simply today with talking about what cohesion is and the different types of cohesion, and then go into my own workshop. So in terms of just the basic definition of what cohesion is, this is just the links, both grammatical and lexical, within a text or sentence that hold the text together and gives it meaning. And the two main types that we have, as I mentioned, is grammatical and lexical. And these each of these types have their own method of linking the different parts of a text. So in terms of lexical cohesion, this is the way that vocabulary is used, so the semantic links within a text. And this creates continuity of meaning and reinforces semantic relationships between elements in the text. And there are two broad categories that when we think of cohesion, and this is reiteration and collocation. So reiteration is when we're repeating the same word, the same idea through use of synonyms, near synonyms, superordinates or hyponyms, and then collocation, of course, is the tendency of certain words to co-occur or to be commonly used together. And in my little example, we have strong tea or heavy rain. When it comes to grammatical cohesion, this refers to structure. So before we were talking about vocabulary, here we have structure. And this holds the text together by using things like referencing, substitution, ellipsis, and conjunction. So referencing our pronouns, our demonstratives, and others that refer back to previously mentioned entities in the text. Substitution, when we're replacing one item with another. Ellipsis is omission, and conjunction are words or phrases are the transition signals. So some of the misconceptions that students have about cohesion. So in my experience as both a writing instructor and as a proofreader, and of course, within the literature, we see that students say to me, my teacher told me to never repeat a word. So I should never repeat anything. They also tend to overuse pronouns. So you get lots of pronouns in one sentence. Another thing that I see students doing is they're misusing or omitting cohesive devices when they write. And in particular, they're misusing those transition signals at the beginning of the sentence in my personal experience. And then we have, of course, interference from the first language discourse patterns when they're trying to bring their own voice into their writing. And then, of course, we have limited lexical awareness, so their vocabulary is preventing them from making those little connections between the sentences and within the text. And then finally, and perhaps what I encounter with these scientists and researchers is just the lack of awareness of just how important cohesion is. So when we keep this in mind, when the students walk into the classroom and sit down, or they come into a proofreading session with me, I have to have some of this in the back of my mind and make sure that I attend to some of these misconceptions that students have. So if we look in the literature, this supports what you may have also experienced in the classroom. So for example, in Gallia, they found that many students only knew about 3 types of cohesive devices. So our reference words, conjunction, and lexical cohesion, but didn't really think about the other ways that you could use other words to form cohesive ties. There was also another study in 2017 where they saw that a lot of students were familiar with the concept of cohesive devices, but there was this gap because many of those students felt their writing still lacked cohesion. So indicating that even when students were aware, they weren't sure of how to actually apply those cohesive devices. And then finally, in 2003, very recently, we saw that cohesive devices are often overlooked by students. And so they're overusing, underusing, and misusing them. And that, of course, impacts their writing quality and the coherence of their writing. So so what are some of the ways that we see in the literature that we could potentially effectively teach cohesive techniques? So if the students already know about them and they are struggling to apply them, what can we do as educators? So here is a really nice little summary of what's out there. So trying to provide explicit instruction on different types of cohesive devices, using authentic examples and model analysis, have students actually practice identifying cohesive ties to build awareness of how cohesion operates. Of course, we also want to make sure we're explaining the role of cohesion in comprehension. So it's not just about production, but there's also comprehension happening. Explicitly linking that ability to track cohesive ties to improve reading comprehension. And I think this is something that a lot of the writers that I work with don't always think about how writing and reading go together. So this is something that I like to talk about in my classes. And then to explain how cohesive devices integrate meaning across text and how they connect ideas. And then there are the standard using fill in the gap exercises or close exercises, and then providing feedback on the writing samples that the students produce to build their productive skills. So having this all in mind, I'm going to walk you through one of my workshops on cohesion for students. So as Miriam mentioned, the profile of the writers that I work with at the Academic Writing Center are adults. They're doctoral students, they're postdocs, and they're faculty. They're typically upper and intermediate B2 level of English. Sometimes we have B1s, but not very often. And 80% of those students are writing their first manuscript in English for publication in a scientific journal. And when I poll my class, about 10% enjoy writing, 80% are eager to learn, and 10% want someone else to write the manuscript for them. But what they all have in common is that they want to publish and they want to be cited. And just to give you an idea of the order in which we address topics in our series of writing workshops, we start off with reader-writer dynamics. We talk about topic stress, organization of information, and then notice cohesion is fairly early on in our series because it's it's just a big, huge topic for our students to really get in there and practice. And then voice, structure, text reduction methods, and then very specific to scientific publication. So my goal is whenever I have one of these workshops with my students, I want them to walk away having more impactful writing that's true to their voice. I want them to enhance the skills that they already have because I do work with adults and they've been writing and reading for a long time. So I want them to realize and have confidence in the skills they already have and be able to make informed choices. So how does a course on cohesion with me start off? So I give them this comparison of a text and I give them a few moments to read, and I ask them to think about which one they prefer to read in terms of getting the meaning or the message across. What if they are on a busy train, crowded, scrolling on their phone, trying to read, which one is easier to follow and understand? And so this is from Swales and Feek. And this is typically used for another purpose, but I like to use it as a comparison of trying to do an exploratory, see what the students already know about cohesion, what stands out to them when they compare the two. And what I find is that most of the time they notice that on the left, they notice that a lot of the sentences start with the. And on the right, they say, oh, it has those little phrases that we learned a long time ago. I said, okay, yeah. So, but there is I would say about 20% of the students say they like the paragraph on the left. And because for them, it's straightforward, it's like a little list on the refrigerator, it gets to the point. So it's really interesting that sometimes the students actually say the one on the left. So I take what they already know and I build upon this little quick little activity at the beginning of the class to see how I might guide them with the rest of the course. So in general, what I cover in terms of specific cohesive devices in my class are these here. And I give them terminology that I think is useful for them to remember. I try not to use too many linguistic or grammatical terms, but sometimes I do throw them out there so they can go off and learn on their own. But we cover linking words, repeated words, substitution, ellipsis, reference words, and shell nouns. So those are all of the devices that I tell them we're going to cover in order to help them create connections for meaningful text and to keep telling them that they need to have text that flows, that's logical, that's well organized if they want to be cited, if they want people to actually be excited about their work and take away the message that they intend. So then I move on to giving them this little example. And I ask them, what makes this paragraph difficult to understand? And most of the time they realize that instead of now that the, we have the other extreme here, and we have every sentence beginning with a transition signal. So most of the time, this is also yet another little interactive, quick show of hands, or if I'm in person with their neighbor, see if they can come up with something. But most of the time, I'm teaching online. And so what I like to give my students is this image. We talk about these transition signals as zombie words, and I believe that Helen Sword actually came up with that term. But all of these howevers, indeeds, furthermores, moreovers, that really, if they overuse them, it's not going to help at all with the flow and the connection of the text, and that they need to really understand how to use these appropriately in order to have a nice, well-structured, flowing text. So what I show them then is I give them a little definition of what linking words and phrases are, and then I give them a list of the most commonly used functions of those linking phrases in academic writing. And then I make sure to emphasize that they shouldn't be overused, just like in our that initial paragraph that I showed, that they need to be careful, don't have those zombies come back, and that in fact skilled scientific writers use other cohesive devices more often than the linking words. And then I have a couple of things that I notice as a proofreaders that I like to share in during class that I see a lot of scientific writers making errors, in particular because I work a lot with French native speakers. These two things are something that I see a lot where when they go to use things like firstly and lastly, they don't have, it's not part of a list, but they haven't figured out how to make a nice, satisfying last sentence in a paragraph. And so they just stick on a finally or lastly, but they need to be reminded that this needs to be part of a list. And then this other pitfall to avoid for our writers in particular is the use of besides. So this is something that I put in. And sometimes there are other things that I talk about depending on how experienced the writers are in my class. If I know a couple of other things, I might throw those in as well. And I take questions if they have any questions about this in particular. So then when it comes to this idea of repeated words, this is something that I have to really spend some time on, because a lot of the students, especially because as I mentioned, French students, they've been taught at school that it's bad to repeat the same word. And so I have to really make sure that the students understand that they don't have to find a synonym for everything. And in particular, this is important for scientific writing, which has to be precise and concise. You shouldn't be using synonyms for really important terms or technical terms. And there are consequences when you do that as a researcher, as a scientific writer. So I give them this little piece of advice that repeated words related to the focus of the paper, and especially if it's technical, a technical term or a term that they themselves have come up with, they need to maintain that they shouldn't be finding any other ways, but everything else, they can feel free. So this might not be entirely clear to them, my explanation. So what I do is then give them something to look at. So this is from Bottomley 2022, a textbook that I love to use in my classroom. So this is an example of reader-friendly repetition of the nouns danger and nuclear. And so we can see here that these are central to the focus of this paragraph. And so the writer isn't trying to find synonyms for these at all. They're maintaining the use of that. I point out to the students that notice that although it's being repeated, notice that there is some distance between those repetitions, between the sentences. They're in different places in the sentences and things like that. And I also tell my students to read things out loud. That when they read their writing out loud, this is a great way for them to hear whether or not something sounds repetitious, and maybe they need to move their sentences around. So if I have a particularly lively group, I might have somebody, a volunteer, read this, but most of the time I read it out loud so they can hear what it sounds like. And then in terms of what about the synonyms, we can use them when a world is not central to a main idea. And I give them this sort of advice to try to follow, to give them a little bit of a rule of when to use them. You'll notice that I don't really talk about collocations in our class because there's already these particular devices that I think that they are able to apply right away, and collocations can get a little complicated, so I don't talk about them in my class. The other thing I love to have them do in either in breakout rooms, or if I have a small class, we might go around and each person does this, is this little choice where they have to decide whether or not they keep the term or they go to pronoun use. And this is such a great activity. I really love it. It generates so much discussion. And while I show the key next for this little activity, oftentimes I just take whatever, if they can justify why they're choosing one over the other, then it really pleases my instructor heart that they're able to actually justify, oh, but we should use this here because we've used it already, even though omega-3 is a central theme, etc. So I really like this activity, and it really sparks a lot of discussion in my experience. The other thing that I like to point out is here, Leslie Rhodes in the she. So with a lot of students for whom they have a gendered language, I point out that the she here is not ambiguous, because in English, she is only for people or animals. And so that also, again, generates some discussion about that. And then we also actually start to talk about gender neutral language in scientific writing as well. So this is kind of an old example, but I love it. It's got lots of little points of discussion. And then this is the answer key here, but there is variation. I also like to show them how when it comes to thinking about whether they're trying to go back and forth between their term and maybe a pronoun, to keep in mind that they want to limit their pronoun use, and then I go and talk about that in a little bit. So then the next thing I talk about is substitution. And I love talking about this because for most of the ESL writers I talk to, they're not even aware of this. This isn't even on their radar. So I love to give them another tool that maybe they haven't considered, that they weren't aware of, that they can then go home and try to use. So this is the little definition I give them. And this example here, so doing so, that's in bold. Here I pose to the class, so what is this referring to? And then it's interesting to see a lot of them do get that it's signing your contract before starting your job. So that whole concept. And again, another way to give them a lot of choices, have their own voice when they go and sit down and write themselves. I give them a few more examples of substitution because for the most part, they're probably not aware. I don't have an interactive activity for this because in my experience, because they don't necessarily have this in their toolbox yet, I want them to sit and think about the substitution technique for cohesive devices. So once we do that, then I talk about ellipsis, and this is also a little hard for them to grasp, but I like to emphasize that it's easy to use when you're introducing items in a list or when using the passive voice. And in particular, because I work with scientific writers, I tell them this is the perfect time to use ellipsis is when that little paragraph at the end of the introduction section of an article where you have to say, this paper is organized as follows in section 1, da, 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 and section 2, da, 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 da. They can actually use ellipsis in their writing almost immediately. And I have this little example here from, I love this website, the English for Academic Purposes Foundation, so EAP foundation.com. And it's wonderful for the students to take hold of their own questions. I can put this link in the chat for people. Okay, there it is. And so this is what what they get to play around with. Okay, oh, it doesn't seem to be advancing. Sorry. There we go. So, sorry, it seems to have skipped ahead a bit. Okay, so then I have this little, this other little activity that I do using WooClap. So what the students do is they scan that QR code in the corner there, and it's a word cloud by this using this online software, and that's available through my university, but I believe that it's actually freely available for any educator to use. The free version, I believe, is just limited to 10 students, so if you have more than 10, you might not be able to use it in your classroom. I tested it out on my 10-year-old son, and he loves it. So I really quite like that tool along with Kahoot, but this particular QR code is for this omitted nouns. So they have to sit there, and sometimes if it's a kind of a lower level group, I'll put them into pairs or in little groups, otherwise individual, and they just submit to the word cloud. And once I see that there's been enough contributions, then I show them the answer key where they can see. So sometimes they come up with some things that I wouldn't have thought of, but as long as I see that they've got the idea that they see, and in fact, the researcher is probably the most frequently omitted piece of information in scientific writing. It's always understood that researchers are doing the work, or the author or the literature, etc. So that's often omitted. And then we have these other examples, but that's what I emphasize for scientific writing. So after WooClap, then we start to talk about personal and relative pronouns. And so this is something they're really familiar with. And here the caution is that they need to make sure that they're not overusing them, because this is what I see a lot in my proofreading sessions, is this overuse of personal and relative pronouns that makes it quite difficult to follow when they put multiple pronouns in one sentence. So I have just a simple fill in the gap again from Bottomley, where they make some decisions of whether or not they're using it or which. And that's usually a nice, easy one. They quite like it. And we have a talking point about this which and this it. It's quite a fun little activity that they do. And then this is the big one that I end on in terms of the different cohesion techniques, because shell nouns are a defining feature of academic English, so I make sure to really spend some time on it. Most of the time they are already aware, so when we talk about what students already know when they come in, they're already aware of shell nouns, and but they weren't sure, they didn't know what exactly they were doing, and I see a lot of the times that students aren't using them correctly. So it often seems too obvious for them, actually, because they do so much reading. They notice that these and then this approach, that technique, this trend, this feature, etc. So notice that so many of my, these are all real world examples that are adopted from Bottomley. And I end my class with this paragraph where I go through each of some of the cohesive devices that we've talked about. So I asked them to look for linking words, and there in fact are none in this. And I love this example that it doesn't have the linking words. There aren't any howevers or moreovers. And then I asked them to look for repetition of terms, and they see right away this technical term that is repeated throughout the paragraph. I asked them for the synonyms, and so then they they see right away that the synonyms that are being used in the paragraph are about the hotness or spiciness of the chili, which isn't central. And so the writer can feel free to have freedom with that. And then some of the reference words. So again, these personal pronouns and relative pronouns aren't being used very often. And I make sure to emphasize that there's only one in the sentence. There aren't multiple pronouns, helping with clarity and flow of the text. And then finally, with the shell nouns here, there's just one shell noun at the very end, this effect. So again, there isn't this overuse of shell nouns. There isn't this overuse of pronouns. There are no transition signals. And this is what nice, clear, cohesive writing for scientific writers looks like. And I love using this example for my writers. So to sum up, as I mentioned before, those effective ways to teach cohesive techniques, in particular for me, I love that using real world examples, authentic examples and models are really what makes, when I teach this particular workshop for the students, really pop, because it's relevant for them. As maybe they've had it before, maybe they're familiar with it, but they haven't seen it in use in scientific writing. And the benefits are just a few of them. They help our ESL students to produce more coherent, meaningful, and sophisticated writing. So they're not just, writing little short sentences, that refrigerator to-do list or that little recipe, but they're actually able to make decisions to have complicated and sophisticated writing that maybe better reflects their own voice and their own mental thinking. It enhances their reading comprehension abilities because they are becoming aware of how, because we're analyzing how these cohesive ties are being used, and then they can apply it in their own writing. And then, of course, we hope it's bridging the gap between the discourse patterns of their first language and those of English. So these are my list of resources. I'm just going to take a picture of my books that I'm constantly using. So you'll see there's the bottomly one up here that has a lot of the exercises that I talked about today. So thank you for your attention. And if there's time for questions, I'm happy to ask. And you can also contact me at my email address if you want to discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That's super, super interesting. Are there questions?
I have a question about if I
Alright.
can ask, if I you like not type in the chat if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. For me, that's fine.
Are these students freshmen?
No, they're doctoral students, so they're in their first year of their graduate PhD program or
Sorry.
higher. The majority of the students who take the course are second to third year, because for those of you who aren't in Europe, PhD takes only 3 years, and they start writing their manuscript around the second year so that they can graduate with a publication by their third year.
That makes sense. Sorry, I didn't catch that part.
Mm-hmm.
I think there might be some other questions, but my question is this is cohesion the kind of thing that like AI is bad at? And so, yeah.
Oh boy, I could talk about generative AI for a long time. But I think what generative AI does is, in particular with kind of the shell noun cohesive device, it doesn't actually quite know what to do with that, because it doesn't realize, at least for academic English, there's a definition it's referring to, right? So it just says this enhancement or this approach, and so I would say it's particularly bad at shell nouns. I would need to do a little bit more of a literature search to back that up. But in my own experience, when I see it, it's not using, really not using this defining characteristic of academic English and shell nouns. So, but I think generative AI is a whole nother discussion for the day, another day.
Thanks. I feel like maybe AI is bad at this. It's bad at all of this. And so sort of that might be a good hook for the students to be like, all right, you could have AI write this whole thing for you. However, it will be so much better if you learn these techniques and, fix it up after it's done. What do you think,
Yeah,
Minnie?
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
So one of the things that that generative AI does terribly is it just rambles on and on. And in particular with scientific writing and academic writing, you need to be concise and precise, right? So when I see it's starting to happen. So when I see a student with a really long text, I start to suspect, was this generative AI? And when I look at it further, a lot of these things are missing. And I think a lot of them is cohesion based because it's not, there aren't those intuitive, our mental vocabulary, our lexical vocabulary is so much richer than whatever the data set is, I think. So
I think that might be a really good hook to get students excited. You are better
yeah,
than AI.
yeah. And I mean, we're actually suffering at the moment. So our proofreading sessions have gone down a lot. And we think it's because of generative AI that students are over relying on it and they don't think they have to come to the writing center because they have generative AI. So
Thanks.
some rebranding definitely has to happen.
Great. Are there other questions? I know people feel shy, but ask your question anyway.
Can I ask?
Go, Zena.
Yes. Thank you for a great presentation because it was very informative for us. And I see that as a school teacher, we are just touching a little bit the rules of the writing part. And you mentioned about the connection of reading and the writing. And do you mean that by reading such kind of academic articles, we can improve our writing too?
Not specifically reading about cohesion, but actually as you're reading whatever genre of text you're working with and you're actively analyzing with that cohesion device eye, you become a lot more aware of reading because your comprehension can't help but improve because we've got, remember, lexical cohesion and grammatical cohesion, and that lexical cohesion, one of the struggles I mentioned is the students don't always have the vocabulary range to make those ties, sort of like generative AI. So what I meant by reading more, it's not necessarily the research behind all of this, but actively reading whatever text is you're teaching, and it's whether it's for grade 3 children or adults, being actively taking a look at what the text that you're looking at is only going to help with reading comprehension.
Thank you. I got you right properly, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Minisha says, read, pay attention to language and use, and then apply. So I can actually share very quickly this read, then use, then apply. So here's something called the mirror board that we use. If you're not aware, this is again a free interactive whiteboard for those of you who teach online a lot. So when I have the cohesion the paragraph you saw here, and then I've got, then they have to write this 3 to 4 sentence paragraph, 500 word max, and they have to use, we talk about topic, stress, different topic, and cohesion, and I challenge them to use all the cohesion devices that we talked about. So read, analyze, and apply, and then they are writing their contributions here. Sometimes this is a group activity, sometimes it's individual, it depends on the level and the size of my class. So.
Are you sharing that in the chat?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was still sharing my screen.
You are, but we just see your QR code.